Saskia Huc-Hepher, who is a senior lecturer in French translation at the University of Westminster and has done a lot of work, including a big publication, Big Data Society Modern Languages, Open. Is that right?
Modern Languages Open and Big Data Society,
okay.
Two separate
things, and various other things, and we'll be talking on hidden histories in the archived web, Habitus, transformation and Hysteresis, potential among London French bloggers. Saskia.
Thank you. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about my research on the French community in London. I have a feeling I might be tight for time, so I'll move forward quite quickly if that's all right with you. So for those of you who aren't familiar with web archives, the UK Web Archive came about in 2014, I think, some years after the US Internet Archive, which started harvesting websites in 1996, and it was harvesting websites across the World Wide Web. And JISC actually purchased the entire .uk domain from them in 2013-14 and created the UK Web Archive. The idea behind the Web Archive obviously being to future-proof against a possible digital black hole, because the British Library, who hosts the UK Web Archive, were aware that lots of digital authorship was actually being lost because websites become extinct, and all of this knowledge and creativity was disappearing before their eyes. So the mission of the UK Web Archive, according to their website, is to reflect the diversity of lives throughout the UK. And in order to do that, they sponsored some special collections which are open access, so you can access them from any computer, unlike the UK Web Archive where you need to be at the British Library. And in that spirit, I created the London French Special Collection back in 2015, I think it went live, just to try and reflect and preserve the French presence online for posterity. It's a very large community, as you all know, but it's also quite an invisible community, and so I thought it was important to preserve this digital heritage for the future. And from a research perspective, using a web archive provides you with a secure platform, because it's one which you can obviously go back to over time, and in the safe, in the knowledge that what you're looking at isn't going to disappear in theory. I mean, that's why I put in principle. It's also part of the mission is to take snapshots over time of websites. So most of the ones I've put in the collection are collected every 6 months. But having just checked the archive recently, I noticed that it hasn't been updated for a couple of years, and the British Library have a backlog, quote unquote. So I think there are kind of monetary restrictions because it is labour intensive, unlike the legal deposit archive where everything is done automatically. So that's the kind of background to my research that I'm going to talk to you about today. From a theoretical point of view, I've been looking at websites, in particular one blog which we'll be talking about today, from an ethno-semiotic perspective. So this combines ethnography with social semiotics, and in particular a Bourdieusian take on ethnography in terms of methods, and Günter Kress's take on analysing websites, so an emphasis on multimodality. So although Herman describes language as an ethno-semiotic resource, which it very much is, multimodality acknowledges the fact that digital authorship websites are inherently multimodal objects, and they have to be analysed in a very particular way that takes account of that. And as for the theories of Bourdieu that I'm using, I mentioned in the title Habitus and Hysteresis. So very broadly speaking, I suppose you could say that Habitus is the internalized and externalized identity of somebody, really, in a nutshell. That's a massive oversimplification. And hysteresis is this disconcerting effect that can take place when somebody's habitus is out of sync with the social field in which they find themselves. And obviously this is a phenomenon which often happens to people when they migrate to a country, but it can also happen in reverse once they've been living in a country for a long time and then they go home and they feel that they're not actually at home anymore. So those are the two aspects that I'm looking at in this blog. And I thought it lastly useful to mention Oliver and O'Reilly, who have done a study on the English community in Spain, on the southern coast of Spain. And they say that despite movement to new diasporic fields, there are ultimately limits to the possibilities of reinventing and transforming habitus over time. So what I'm interested in looking at in this blog is to see if habitus, as it is manifested online, has undergone change. Has it been able to transform itself? Has it reinvented itself or not? And by looking at web archives, we can trace this transformation or otherwise. And also, in order to analyze habitus in a more structured way, I've kind of conceptualized it in this triadic form, breaking it down into habit, habitat and habituation, all of which are elements referred to by Bourdieu and other scholars, but never necessarily put together in a whole like that. But it's important to remember that they act dynamically with each other. So this is the blog that we'll be looking at today, which is called Teatime in Wonderland. And this is the first instance of the blog that I came across in the Internet Archive, and that's from 2009. And what we see here is authorial translanguaging. So the main article, the main post here is in French, but the title of the article is in English. And if you scroll down to the very bottom of the page, you'll find a condensed English version of the same article, but without the images embedded in the text. So I'd argue that there's a dominance of French in this early version of the blog. But there is translanguaging going on. So underneath the title of the blog, Teatime in Wonderland, we have Que faire en Angleterre, avec ou sans enfants, what to do in England with or without kids. But French is first, nonetheless. So we get the feeling that French is a dominant language at this point in time. In terms of the blog banner, we have a rather typical or even stereotypical image of London, i.e. St Paul's Cathedral. It's not, I'm not sure why she chose this image and who she's aiming at with this image. It would suggest perhaps a French audience because of the dominance of the French language and because of the iconic image that she's chosen, which is universally known and recognized. So at this point in time, the blog is suggesting a fundamentally French habitus and a kind of outsider's tourist perspective on London, as we see in the image there. And finally, if we think compositionally, or if we look at the tabs, we see at the top there we only have 4 tabs. They're all in English: home, about, contact and map. And they're all kind of blogger centric. There's not much there about London, and yet this is supposedly a London blog. If we fast forward in time to 2013, so this is the first instance captured in the UK Web Archive, so 4 years later, we can see that there's been a fundamental transformation to the design of the blog. We have, in particular, a reinvented banner. So I would argue that this version of the blog is actually far more coherent and cohesive than the one that we saw before. We've got an intersemiotic relationship between the title of the blog, Teatime in Wonderland, and the imagery of the banner now. So we have the white rabbit there from Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland, obviously, which has this intertextual coherence to it. Similarly, the subheading of the title is now La Magie de Londres. So it's a lot clearer what this blog is about. It's about London, it's about this magic that entices French people to come and live in London. And even if we think about modes and how far we can break down meaning, you could argue that the font type for the Teatime in Wonderland is consistent with that idea of magic. It looks slightly Harry Potter-esque and antiquated. So yeah, it's a lot more coherent and cohesive. And there are other differences now. We have 2 versions of the blog available. So rather than it being kind of top-down translanguaging by the author, the user of the blog can choose whether they want to look at the French version or the English version. So there is a hybrid existence going on here, and in fact that is to a certain degree mirrored in the imagery, because we have arguably a hybrid habitus. We've got the depiction of tea time, fundamentally stereotypically English habit, but depicted through elements of an arguably French habitat, because we've got a Louis XV chair and something that looks more like a coffee pot, in my opinion, than a teapot. So we've got this kind of merging of habitats and habits going on. And the distinct versions of the blog in the different languages. And in terms of the tabs, we still only have 4, but they're a bit more London-based now. So we've got London, 65 ideas with kids, and Romantic London, 61 ideas. So we can see now that the blogger is discovering London, discovering the London habitat with her children, with her partner, and those habits that she's now taken on, and this awareness of the space that she's become used to, are coming through in the blog. So we get a sense of her being more embedded in the London context. If we click onto the French version of the blog, on the article we were at before, which was about Belfast, we're actually misdirected and end up with a post from 2014 about Paris. So I thought it's interesting the way digital archives have very much in common with physical archives in that respect. They are prone to broken resources, incomplete resources. It's difficult to find things which you know are in there. So very much the same challenges are found when dealing with digital archives. But what is good about archives of websites is they are in theory navigable. They aren't just snapshots. You can dig down into various levels of the website. So if you click back onto the English version here, you do end up with the corresponding article. And interestingly, in view of what we've been talking about before, it's a self-translated version of the text. And if we think about it from a translation point of view, there are some differences here that you might not expect between the French and the English versions. So in the blue highlighted bit here, we can see she's entered a whole sentence which isn't in the French version at all. I never used to come here when I lived in Paris, recently discovered that neighbourhood. There's also a stylistic difference. The French version is kind of more aesthetically pleasing, and the English version is a little more informal, a little more spoken in tone. This might be to do with how she's learnt her English in the field, as it were, rather than through literature, possibly. There are some mistakes, mistranslations. For example, La douceur du Paris d'antan is translated as a sweet atmosphere, and here we get the sense that she's not quite feeling the nuances of the English language yet. A sparkling place is another example, quartier pétillant, which would probably be better translated as effervescent or vibrant. So she is kind of, again, it's this hybrid habitus, almost in the French English culture, compensating for losses. So whereas she's got several English words in the French text, une âme design, street art, s'accrocher des love-locks, to compensate for that, she uses a French expression in the English text, so to keep that exoticism in the other direction, this vieille France. And also what I found interesting was in green there, the reference to a village quality, a sense of humour, splashes of colour and inventive cuisine, because these are all not specifically mentioned in the French version, but they're all points that came through very strongly in my interviews. So my ethnosemiotic approach also was combined with on-land research as well as online. So I find it interesting that she's kind of tapping in to those qualities that were found in London when she's describing Paris in this case. If we move forward to 2017, so this is the most recent version which is archived. It's in the Internet Archive because the British Library is behind. We can see again that there's been a fundamental change to the look and the feel of the blog. This is the landing page. The banner's gone and we simply have this collage of photographs instead. For me, it's slightly less coherent than the version that we saw before, because we have the names. You can kind of guess that that's the name of the blog if you go there for the first time, Teatime in Wonderland, but the relationship between the white rabbit and these photographs is unclear. And the photographs themselves don't seem to be relating to London in any way. I mean, there is, St Paul's is there, but you can hardly make it out. So it looks more like a travel blog now than a blog about London. And similarly, we have some new tabs. We've gone from 4 previously to 9 now, with additions being Work with Me, London, London with Teenagers, Paris, Cooking, Travels, and the Contact tab has gone. It's been replaced with the Work with Me tab. So again, it's almost as if the blog has lost its identity, and we've got Cooking and Travels and Paris coming in where it should really be London-centric. And I suppose in terms of the tabs as well, we get an idea that the habits are evolving again. It's not just London with the kids and the teenagers. We get an idea of it becoming a more commercial entity because of the Work with Me, and indeed that might be why we have so many images here, because she's showing off or showcasing her photographic skills. But what's fundamental, the change in this version, is that it's in English only now. There's no French left at all in the articles or in the tabs or in the subheading. It's a completely English version of the blog. So we wonder now, who is the audience? Is it aimed at English people, or is it possibly aimed at a worldwide audience for whom the English language is the lingua franca? And now if we move to the live web, so this was just last month, we see again a very significant change to the blog. It's the technological affordances of the platform have increased. So we have now just 4 large photographs on the landing page, and we're fading in between, in and out of these 4 photographs. One's Brighton Pier, one's a yoga class, one is eating sushi in Spitalfields Market, and this one is a kind of cartoonesque version of London, which again is very typical of London French blogs. So what the photographs depict again reflect perhaps an evolving, a growing habitat and habits, but there's no trace of the white rabbit. So the title doesn't make so much sense anymore. Teatime in Wonderland, we're not sure where Wonderland is supposed to be, especially because of the subtitle. I'm not sure that I can read it, you certainly can't. Coheres with the title at all anymore. It is, here it is, Stop Dreaming, Start Packing, Adventure is Around the Corner. So again, slightly odd. Who is that aimed at? I'm wondering whether she's now speaking to this worldwide audience for whom packing their bags means coming to visit London. So it's kind of looking out rather than looking in at a local London French or French audience. So in a way, because of the tabs which have been pared down to just 5 now, and they cover London with teenagers, London with kids, romantic London, and work with me. So all of that noisy reference to cooking and travelling has gone. So in a way there's more coherence on a contextual level, but arguably less textual coherence between the subtitle and the title and the texts themselves. So this use of English only, it could be to do with the audience, as I mentioned, but it could also be a representation of a sense of linguistic hysteresis. One wonders whether the blogger is now more at ease, more at home in the English language than the French language, and that's why everything's exclusively in English at this point in time. And perhaps that's also feeding into the imagery. We've lost the quirkiness of that 2009 version of the website, 2013 version of the website that we had. And that quirkiness is something that came through in my interviews as being appealing to French Londoners. One of my interviewees said, in London, à Londres, l'excentricité est encore permise et respectée, which is something she felt was lacking in France. And this eccentricity, this quirkiness that we had with the White Rabbit is gone in this version of the website. So to some extent, we have a standardization coming through. And just going back to my interviews, I think what's interesting about having analysed the blog and the change over time is that although most of the people I've spoken to say that they don't feel that they're part of the French community is somebody else, probably in South Kent. There is nevertheless a sense of community that comes through the common unity of practices, and I think that's been demonstrated in the blog as well. So here we have a photograph of the blogger with a tattoo on her arm, which we didn't see in, which I hadn't seen in previous photographs of her. And when I have students coming over from France, it's interesting how you see them change their look over time during their London, 3-year stay. And one of my interviewees said, "Quand je sors à Paris, si j'ai les jambes à l'air," she had tattoos all over her legs, "les gens sont là, mon Dieu, elle est différente." So she's saying, when I go out in Paris, if my legs are exposed, people just say, "Oh my God, she's different." And she's actually had quite a hostile reaction to these tattoos. Similarly, one French person spoke about the discovery that she'd actually become a foreigner at home, and at home was now London. And I think we get that sense coming through in the blog as well. "Je n'étais plus chez moi en France, chez moi c'était à Londres. Je crois que c'est ça, je n'avais pas réalisé que ce n'était plus chez moi en France." So I didn't realize that I was no longer at home in France. And then finally, this linguistic hysteresis effect that we saw perhaps coming through in the blog through the conversion to English only is mirrored in my interviews. "Je suis maintenant au point où mon français devient parfois difficile et mon anglais il n'est plus au top non plus, donc je me sens un peu parfois pris entre les deux. C'est étrange, c'est un peu comme un no man's land." So I'm at the point where my French is a bit difficult and my English isn't great either. So I'm feeling a bit caught between the two. It's weird and it's a bit like a no man's land. And that's certainly this idea of hysteresis kind of expressed spontaneously by one of the interviewees. So just the last slide before I end, we mentioned the self-translation, but another thing that becomes apparent when you look at the different archive snapshots is self-editing. So on the About Me blurb from 2017, and the equivalent blurb in 2018, we can see that she's actually made some quite significant changes to what she's said. For example, she mentions a cupcake in 2017, and in 2018 she mentions a bowl of perfect French fries with a glass of Ruinart Blanc de Blanc. So it's almost as if she's gone from somebody who's interested in the eating habits of the UK which are quite stereotypical, the cupcake, to almost an English Francophile looking on at the French pleasures. And then linguistically it's interesting as well, because those difficulties with nuance that she had with the earlier versions are now rather different. She uses very hackneyed expressions, idiomatic expressions like "my guilty pleasure" or "I write happy," "stop dreaming, start living," "getting out of your comfort zone." So very idiomatic, colloquial expressions coming through. And also we can see it's a much shorter version. So again, there's an awareness of the stylistic norms, the typographical habits, a habituation to these habits coming through the text itself. And also the way that she ends it off with, "I'd love to hear from you, Coralie," as if it was an email to her friend, whereas the original version was a lot more informative, but perhaps less informal and less personal. So to conclude then, one of my interviewees said, "C'est le passage du temps qui fait l'intégration." It's the passage of time which brings about integration, and I think that's what we've seen by looking at the passage of time over this single blog. We've seen evidence of changes to the habitat, the habits, and habituation to these changing habits and habitat. We've seen the blog originally in 2009 looking like more of a French habitus, and then moving through to a kind of hybrid London French one in 2014, and then ending up in something which is ostensibly English, both visually and textually. At times there was incoherence, and perhaps this is a reflection of what Mulholland and Ryan refer to as identity slippage. Perhaps the identity confusion that we saw in the blog reflected her own kind of struggle to position herself identity-wise. Hysteresis, potentially, as I say, you could perhaps read into the exclusive uses of English as a feature of her being less comfortable in the French language. But most importantly, perhaps, I think it's the historic value of web archives. None of these changes would have been traceable without the use of web archives, because the online live version only gives you the last couple of slides that I showed. And that's all.